Siam is a vexing place for foreigners. They see the opportunity and can enter the country and trade, but it's hard to make inroads or engage satisfactorily. The French were in Siam at the same time as the Persians I just mentioned. Gita Shah, a French Jesuit visiting Narai's kingdom in the 1600s, wrote of the difficulties the Christian missionaries faced in the country. Gita Shah tells us that Constantine Falcon, the Greek sailor who had become the king's favourite minister, suggested that the Christians might impress the Siamese by scientific instruction and copying the habits and austerities of Buddhist monks. We hear from Gita Shah that the Siamese were obsessed with fortune-telling and gambling and loved spectacles. He described a Muslim procession going through the centre of Ayutthaya made up of 2,000 people, writing, "It is true that the nation is a great lover of shows and splendid ceremonies, and by that means it is that the Moors, who celebrate their festivals with a great deal of magnificence, have perverted many of them to the sect of Muhammad. I must assume that the ancestors of the Bunnags were the people who had success converting the locals. What is missing from the French evaluation is that Muslim converts working for the Trade Department were exempt from tax and conscription. The openness and cosmopolitan nature of Ayutthaya was reversed after the death of Narai. Foreign accounts go silent for centuries." The only other mention I have of the family in this era in the foreign texts is from a Burmese account of the fall of Ayutthaya, where I believe we are granted a glimpse of ancestor Sen fighting and dying. By the early 19th century, the Portuguese and British were back. Here is a passage from J.H. Moore, an Englishman writing in the 1830s, about my ancestor Dit. Now, I've taken some liberties with the names for comprehension's sake. He wrote, "This elevation did not much please the Minister of Trade. He was greatly afraid of losing his more lucrative situation of the Trade Ministry, and when the King offered him his new dignity, he said he would not leave the office of trade because the day his father became Minister of War he died, and he was certain the same fate awaited him. The King, to please his favourite, said he might continue to be Trade Minister and become War Minister also, which was just the very thing the sly fox wanted. This is the first instance of an occurrence of that nature happening in Siam." Moore goes on, "Dit, as Minister of War, was ordered to proceed immediately to Songkhla and from thence to Patani, in order to put an end at once to the disturbance in that quarter. He sailed from Bangkok on the 17th of March in 1832 in a war-boat with a fine gilt stern and gilt head, accompanied by about 18 more war-boats, containing altogether about 3,000 men. Dit, as Minister of War, was invested with royal insignia in the shape of a pyramidical cap or crown, and went down the river in great state, with bands of music playing." I found it useful to hear Dit criticised and mocked. If I only pursued the family anecdotal route, he would be a patriarch who could only be praised. And I was able to build up a picture of Dit through the foreign accounts written by Envoy Edmund Roberts, Missionary Howard Malcolm, foreign military expert Frederick Arthur Neal, which were remarkably consistent. These mosaic pieces brought him to life, a figure of an earlier civilization, very foreign to me, almost of the medieval world. Dit's son Chuang was different. He was a modern figure, had grown up around foreigners, and knew how to present himself. While Dit is in the vein of the Oriental despot or wicked Grand Vizier, Chuang is often praised. He is pictured throughout his life receiving envoys, consorting with members of the European community. He can be found telling jokes, drinking wine, negotiating, being generous, being demanding. But even radiant Chuang was not above criticism. And this is Chuang by Charles Gutzlaff, a missionary who was in Siam in the early 1830s and was absolutely unimpressed by the country. He said of Chuang that he was of superior intelligence, but has a spirit for intrigue which renders him formidable at court and dangerous to foreigners. He looks with contempt upon his whole nation, but crouches before every individual by means of whom he may gain any influence. If we are tired of the privileged white male gaze, then we can pick up with one of the rare privileged white female gazes, that of Anna Leonowens of the King and I fame. She encountered Chuang upon her arrival in Bangkok. She wrote, "Before long a showy gondola, fashioned like a dragon, with flashing torches and many paddles, approached, and a Siamese official mounted the side, swaying himself with an absolute air. The red langute or skirt loosely folded about his person did not reach his ankles, and to cover his audacious chest and shoulders he had only his own brown polished skin. He was followed by a dozen attendants who, the moment they stepped from the gangway, sprawled on the deck like huge toads, doubling their arms and legs under them and pressing their noses against the boards, as if intent on making themselves small by degrees and hideously less. The captain stepped forward and introduced us, His Excellency Jalpayar C. Suryawong, Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Siam. Half naked as he was, and without an emblem to denote his rank, there was yet something remarkable about this native chief, by virtue of which he compelled our respect from the first glance, a sensibly magnetic quality of tone or look. With an air of command oddly at variance with his almost indecent attire, of which he seemed superbly unconscious, he beckoned to a young attendant, who crawled to him as a dog crawls to an angry master. Chuang opens his house to Anna, but she's not at all grateful. She does not strike me as a particularly credible source, but her writing is vivid. She paints a picture of Chuang as a man surrounded by concubines when he had very few wives. Anna describes Chuang going into mourning at the news of King Rama V's accession to the throne. She tells us that he wanted the throne for himself, which strikes me as preposterous given that he was one of the key architects of the succession and stood to gain the most. So white male or female gaze, at least we're given a gaze, and any gaze is better than no gaze at all. And the gaze was also more literally that of the photographer. This early photography is in a sweet spot. There's some knowledge about its importance and use within Siam, but it's still innocent and not yet closed down and controlled as a means of projecting image and propaganda. Its early plate negatives speak volumes. Take for instance the work of John Thompson, Scotsman who created some of the most exquisite photography of the Far East in the mid-19th century and gained access to the court and many of the leading nobles. Here is his portrait of Chuang. The image speaks of impatience. A busy man is formal, but there's something hasty about it, something that cuts through protocol and the mutual self-consciousness of subject and viewer. Remember that the subject would have had to keep still for a long time in order to get a clear exposure without motion blurring. And this one is of Chuang's second wife, Lady Pan, who Anna Leonowens wrote fondly of and seems to have been a fixture for some of the foreigners in Bangkok. She will appear briefly in the journals of Ernest Satow, British Consul General in the late 1880s, 20 years after this image was taken. She had a celebrated garden in the grounds of what would become the Somdet Jalpriya Rajapat University in Thonburi. Lady Pan was a Buranan, which is a family also descended from Mon Bunnag, so she was kind of crypto-Bunnag, and Chuang's third wife was her younger sister. When I started writing the book, a friend who is a keenly progressive type said, "I can understand why you're doing this, but you're still only telling the story of a well-known and privileged minority." And she's right. But it should be pointed out that with all the Bunnag's historical prominence, there's still very little real and compelling storytelling around these figures, and that if we're going to start anywhere in telling the vernacular history of the country, we might just as well start here. I hope that one day someone will stumble on materials that will shed light on unknown subjects and overlook corners. I'm certain that all sorts of stories and histories are waiting to be discovered and told about families and regions and peoples whose histories have been passed over for lack of documentation. I wonder if we'll ever come across the Thai Frederick Douglass, for instance, an insider who could tell us what life was like for Siamese slaves. On the charge of elitism, I might point out there are so many descendants of our Persian ancestor Ahmad and of the thousands of Bunnags that these stories belong to everyone. For me, it's not about who is telling the stories, it's that they're being told and collected and kept going, because they could easily die out. And I believe that all of these family stories of grand and modest families alike enrich us. As a Bunnag, I'm not really from anywhere. One of the first things that's said about the Bunnags is that they come from Persia. After over 400 years, we're still not Thai. And listen to me, I'm a Brit. It's not just because I really am one, it's also because I'm part of a legacy that began with Chuang, of sending children abroad to become foreign. I am the descendant and inheritor of men and women who had a very international and universalist outlook. Family should be proof that we can mix and blend, borrow, repurpose, and reinvent, that we can all choose our story, choose how we relate to the past, and how we relate to its varied beauties. And in this way, it was of course my desire that the book could serve many purposes, describe and preserve something that was very specifically about central Thailand, while being accessible to anyone, anywhere, people who might not be drawn into Thailand, but might want to share in a glimpse of a collective past and a collective humanity.